Hey, YouTube audience. Today we're giving you a sneak peek of exclusive subscriber content. This special presentation is about the future conflict in Europe. We take a deep dive on the Russia and NATO situation and explore what that means for you. Will it be war? Find out here. As news reports continue to pour in regarding the Russian military buildup on the Ukrainian border, NATO leaders are preparing for another military incursion. At the strategic level, each NATO player is explaining the case for a coming conflict. Russian propaganda efforts, meanwhile, are intensifying as decades old submarine accidents are being blamed on NATO activity, which is disproven during the Russian-led investigation of that particular event, as well as online botnet activity. Has We've seen a marked increase in that, and calls about a humanitarian crisis and it being blamed on Ukraine in particular, as well as the West and Poland specifically. So the Russian government is blaming Ukrainians for increased hostilities along the front by propagating months-old videos of artillery fire as a recent event. I saw this on the internet over the weekend. So that's what's being pushed currently, and this rapid expansion of information operations and special operations is very similar to 2014's invasion of Ukraine. And Western observers appear to be politicizing a potential war in Europe, or are at a minimum unwitting participants in a larger psychological operations campaign, which is designed to confuse, delay, or deter military and diplomatic support for Ukraine. And the first slide that we have here pulled up is kind of explaining some of the background beginning in 2014, with Russia using the Winter Olympics in Sochi as an excuse to move massive amounts of troops and military equipment into the region, and then subsequently breaking down what happened on the Crimean Peninsula in particular, along with some of those dates, and then in the eastern portion of Ukraine, the regions that are held by so-called separatists, which are actually just uniformed. They're uniformed Russians who just took off their Russian flags. So an estimated 52 separate Russian military units have engaged in combat and operations against the Ukrainians in those highlighted regions. And the bottom map there shows during 2014, 2015, the Russians and other malign actors, we shall say, used immigration as a hybrid warfare tool against the Europeans in order to push hundreds of thousands or millions of people onto the continent to distract and overwhelm European officials who are trying to address exploding migrant populations inside of their borders. Some nations were much maligned, like Hungary and Poland, for not allowing folks to stay in, while the world largely ignored what was going on in Ukraine. Moving on, in a head-to-head matchup, looking kind of at the forces, we can throw up the NATO one first. The Russians, they have around 300,000 troops staged across their southern and western fronts. There are limited but powerful concentrations in Moldova, Kaliningrad, and Belarus, which give the Russian military unique options, which can be difficult to not only observe but also predict accurately. And talking on NATO for a second, NATO has around 150,000 troops from nearly a dozen nations scattered across their eastern flank. We've highlighted some of those positions there. It's called the Enhanced Forward Presence. And this model keeps multinational and rotational formations ready to respond to crises, as well as train smaller member states in NATO's combined joint doctrine. That means multinational and multi-domain forces. And so the United States has approximately 5,000 troops in the Baltics as well as Poland, meaning that any sort of military action in the region would quickly involve U.S. forces, literally within a matter of hours, should the United States choose to participate, which we likely would. So a smaller but significant European military training presence exists in Ukraine, but it is not officially a NATO operation. Anecdotally, Lithuanians would run into American special forces working in some of these training camps in Ukraine, and they'd be like, "Oh, we didn't know you guys were going to be here," despite being, of course, joint NATO members. So other highlights, you can see there, those are the active defense missions that NATO has running across Europe, and it's pretty substantial. They include, of course, the enhanced forward presence, which we already talked about, multi-domain air defense assets, as well as some electronic warfare units and things of that nature, as well as centers of excellence, which provide high-end analysis as well as a professionalizing university-style structure to train militaries and get the Europeans, NATO, as well as the U.S. kind of all on the same page should we have to eventually go to war with Russia. Now, I say there's 150,000 troops in the region, and that's really an estimate, as NATO does not publicly release a lot of those numbers for operational security reasons. But these enhanced forward presence formations are designed from the get go for a multi domain conflict, and they have capabilities, everything ranging from cyber operations, of course, to conventional warfare assets. Notably, there's a large contingent of U.S. cavalry units in the eastern portion of Europe right now. But like we said, they do conduct these training missions with the Baltics as well as Poland to modernize doctrine, as well as improve interoperability in the event of a high end conflict with Russia, which seems like an increasing proposition day over day. And moving on, taking a closer look at Russia's military and kind of where they are at in the world, starting first with the Western Military District, they have right around or just over 150,000 troops, and the majority of these forces are stationed in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kaliningrad, which are, of course, capital cities and strategic targets or strategic, places for the Russians. But they have sort of emulated NATO's enhanced presence model by deploying several brigade sized elements which are near border regions. And each brigade kind of has this similar multi domain package and buildup where they can do joint operations with other brigades, or they can do sort of individual expeditionary maneuvers in order to harass border forces or conduct exercises near Russian European borders and make everybody get a little concerned. So moving on to the Southern Military District, they have around 100 to 150,000, and the reason why there's such a big spread is because Russia right now is activating reserve units and moving some of them into the region, but they're not necessarily publicizing where these reserve units are being called up to action. But it is in the Southern Military District, most notably. And additional Russian forces, of course, are occupying the Crimean Peninsula, the Luhansk People's Republic, as well as the Donetsk People's Republic since at least 2015. Special operations forces came in a little bit earlier, but they do have a similar expeditionary capability as well as joint fighting capability. And the Russians have done a lot of heavy lifting in modernizing their command and control and communication structure within these units so that they can work either independently or together. And so there is a special emphasis in this particular region on electronic warfare assets, which have been used and deployed against not only Ukrainian military forces, but UN observers who fly drones and stuff in the area. I think they lose a couple of drones a month in some of these electronic warfare operations. So in a broader conflict, of course, Russian maritime forces cut off access to the Black Sea as they control the strait. You can see there in the top left portion of the picture. And moving on, we have a breakdown of the Russian order of battle, looking at some of these army and corps sized units that are basically ready to go at a moment's notice, which is one of the main reasons why the Russians enhanced their forward presence and moved substantial amounts of military equipment in the western and southern military districts over the spring of 2021. It was April to May essentially, and recall it was notable in that the troops supposedly went home and just boarded trains and headed back to their bases, but they left the equipment in place. And as such, they've had a significant ability to fill in those fighting positions for a very rapid invasion of Ukraine, which is kind of where the money's at right now. And so, taking a closer look at some of these repositioned units, we can see on the next pictures there. This is some satellite imagery that was released throughout the year, and these continue to be updated. And we're going to update those for you guys as we get better information. And so, this is in the Southern Military District, in particular, the staging grounds in Yelnya and Vorens. It's easier to read these in Russian. But why those positions matter is they are less than a 5 hour drive or tactical ground movement by some of these units to support either the Belarusian military against the Polish, or to invade northeastern Ukraine either directly from Russia or through Belarus if they want to obfuscate the movement to some degree. So those camps, those pictures are all new. They continue to grow and expand. We're seeing other types of high end facilities at some of these forward bases, like morale, welfare, and recreation facilities being constructed actively, which shows an intent on the part of the Russians that at a minimum they are going to use this as a staging base for potential future operations, and they got to keep the troops entertained. So the Ukrainians, for their portion, have come out and released this intelligence product. It shows a map of the units, the size of the units. It looks like several brigade and maybe some army and corps sized units sitting there just on the Russian side. But what we point out in this breakdown and on the email version of this is that this report was in English. It's not in Ukrainian, so this was not necessarily meant for a domestic military audience in Ukraine. And they're trying to influence the West and any English speaking countries to support an eventual military defense of Ukraine, because it appears that diplomatic solutions are no longer as effective as they once were. And the Ukrainians' assessment that the Russians are going to be able to very quickly take over around a third to roughly half of the country is consistent with other military assessments coming from U.S. forces in particular. And it looks like the Ukrainians believe that they will lose their capital during the initial push, which would make retaking the country particularly difficult, considering the diplomatic and military situation. The Russians do maintain a very overwhelming force. But one thing that I do want to point out here, folks had asked if I'm still sticking to that original 90-day claim that I had made. And for right now, I am, not only because the Ukrainian military is assessing that the Russians will invade by late January, but looking at the Russian deployment cycles, they're pictured on this report in the top right. It shows that there is a 30, 60, 90-day buildup for Russian forces before they dramatically withdraw. And so the Russians are structured to do this in about 90-day windows, and that's what it looks like we are coming up to. So moving on, kind of talking about the broader situation in Europe. First, with Poland, the limited border clashes continue. They're being reported over the weekend. Hundreds of migrants returned to Iraq, while Belarusian authorities relocated a few hundred to a logistics facility nearby the border. And Poland reported that there was only 255 border crossing attempts, which is a substantial reduction compared to last week, where several thousand folks were trying to get across the border in some pretty theatrical movements. But Lieutenant Anna Michalska told a news organization called AFP that some of the migrants, quote, threw rocks and someone also hurled tear gas at Polish officials, while Belarusian personnel were using lasers to blind them being the Polish soldiers, of course. And the arrival of multinational forces on the ground appears to have temporarily reduced tensions along the border. But Belarusian President Lukashenko reportedly is seeking some sort of end to these clashes and has authorized in response currency exchanges, food services, as well as basic amenities in some of these impromptu migrant camps. By introducing those facilities or the services to those migrants, it's going to not only draw more migrants to the region, but also encourage them to maintain their presence in the area for as long as Belarus, I guess, will tolerate them. So, in response, Poland has threatened to close its Kuznica border crossing on the 21st of November, so it was yesterday, if Belarus continued its surge of migrants. And it looks like that it hasn't stopped. We're kind of waiting on the polls to make a decision on if that is going to be closed and how long. I think they said 72 hours initially, but approximately 100 British engineer troops have arrived on the Polish border to advise and assist in constructing hasty defenses along their roughly 250-mile border with Belarus. And so the UK, looking around the map here and what's going on, who's who in the zoo, the UK have activated special air service squadrons and put them on standby for deployment in the region, indicating advocating a two-pronged approach for Ukraine as well as Poland. They're on a prepare to deploy order for either Ukraine or Poland. So advanced teams of special operations forces also conducted airborne and low visibility insertion operations and exercises across the Baltics in conjunction with the diplomatic statements on military readiness. And Belarusian and Russian paratroopers, for their portion, conducted a very similar exercise within 25 kilometers of the Latvian border, covering potential infiltration activities. So it was kind of an interesting operation to watch happen. There was, the standard round parachutes with infantry and paratrooper types. As well as some free fall special forces types who were jumping out of separate aircraft, but not going to the same assembly areas. So it's concerning to say the least. And in response, Estonia, for its portion, is sending 100 National Guard troops to assist with border wall construction in Poland, while at home, the Estonian National Guard continues to place fencing along their border with Russia and suspended all of its air service Russia for a week. While these maneuvers are ultimately useless against an invading Russian military, they do send a signal of unity to the Kremlin. And a major subversion campaign remains underway, of course, in Europe to discredit not only the legitimacy, but also the relevancy of NATO. And we talked about that earlier in the show. And the United States is not viewed as a credible defense partner in many instances. And the Russians are contributing to that as well as the Chinese. So while Russia may not seek ultimately to retake the Baltics and all of Ukraine, they do maintain an interest in creating vassal states, ultimately for financial exploitation, particularly with the growing liquefied natural gas market in the Baltics. They want to keep everyone dependent on Russian gas. And so, looking at what the most dangerous options are, looking forward to this situation, the most dangerous situation would be that the Russians and Belarusian military conduct a joint military action against either Poland or Ukraine. And so, of course, Russia maintains a numerical capability over Ukraine. And by the time the Ukrainian forces are able to mobilize in a meaningful manner, Russia would likely seize and hold up to a significant or a geographic point, which is the Dnieper River. And simultaneous military action against Poland, of course, would immediately or could immediately involve United States as well as UK troops who are already in the region. And that's frankly why they're there. Military provocation against Poland would, of course, incite common defense, which is Article 5. It's a provision of the NATO Charter, and energy supplies to Europe would cease almost immediately. Global supply chains would face catastrophic disruption as flagged commercial vessels would likely become maritime targets. And the EU currently expects a massive cyber disruption, not only to governmental, but as also private communications and financial systems. And we have a map there. This is from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and they show a similar assessment, although they're a little more optimistic than the Ukrainian military is. The European Council on Foreign Relations doesn't anticipate Kiev being taken immediately, but they do expect to get the Russians up to at least that river, which kind of bisects the nation. And so that's the most dangerous course of action. It would, of course, be catastrophic on all sides with massive losses of human life, both military personnel and civilian personnel, and is not what anyone wants. But looking at what's the most likely course of action, the most likely course of action, I maintain, is the formation and formalization of the Union state and a new standoff with NATO. So, this agreement, which originally was signed in 1999, the Union state plan seeks to consolidate Belarusian as well as Russian territory under Putin's control. And the two nations have signed a 28-point agreement on November 4th, which unifies nearly all sectors of economics, energy, as well as defense no later than 2023. So Lukashenko and Putin may call for an end to hostilities, which is kind of the route they appear to be taking, into the hostilities, into the energy disruptions, as well as hybrid warfare on the condition that the European Union or NATO not interfere with the formalization of this Union state agreement and making everybody have to print off new maps. But this will likely spur increased NATO enhanced forward presence missions and delay the conflict for at least a couple of years. And it remains a viable viable diplomatic alternative following the years of post Soviet induced chaos in Eastern Europe. But the Russians do have a limited window of opportunity to force NATO action or to goad Ukraine into a fight, which would, of course, lead into the most dangerous course. So, Ukrainian forces, for their portion, remain in place along the contested borders, and fighting has increased over the last 2 weeks. But the border forces are now carrying live ammunition in anticipation of these migrant surges or Russian infiltration efforts by special operations forces. And the situation does remain eerily similar to the migrant waves we saw in 2014 and 2015, prompting extra scrutiny from Ukraine and its growing bench of Western allies. And I do maintain that in summation here that this is a test of Western resolve and an attempt to induce diplomatic fatigue so that the Union state formalization will receive at a minimum pushback from the European Union and NATO. Thanks for watching. If you want access to these reports, become a subscriber today at www.forwardobserver.com/subscribe for exclusive access and join us on the high side.